The days are surely coming, says the Lord. Now, we often think of prophecy as if it were something like fortune telling, as it being about predicting the future. But prophecy is really less about giving knowledge of the ever mysterious and unknown future, and more about learning how to adopt a new perspective today. While prophecy sometimes looks to the future, it is really more interested in reshaping the way we look at the present than in giving hidden knowledge about things that will happen. It's about imagining the world from a new perspective. Advent, this is the first day of Advent. I get to wear blue. I love wearing blue. It's a short season, so you have to savor the blue. But I wonder if Advent sometimes is really about imagination. So sometimes we don't see the role of imagination in our spiritual lives, in our faith journeys. And I think imagination is important. We use our imaginations, of course, all the time. We use our imaginations when we think about the future. Consciously or unconsciously, we imagine futures. We imagine the futures of our children, our own futures, children, grandchildren. We imagine the future of the planet, the environment, the future of democracy. Now, often, what we imagine about this future is based on our life in the present. We see what's going on, and then we extrapolate, as it were, in our imaginations about what we think will happen. So that's when prophecy helps guide our imagination of the future. Prophecy also interprets the world. The prophets of old wanted to lead people to adopt interpretations about what was going on in their culture, in their times. Now, we regularly interpret our times. We do it all the time. We interpret our current affairs just like we interpret the Bible or any other difficult text. For us, often, our interpretations are informed by what we hear on the news, in blogs, psychologists, philosophers, scientists, in coffee shops, on our phones. When we complain about something or someone, we are basically offering an interpretation of the world. When we let our despair speak, our despair becomes a guide in our interpretation. What is despair? Reinhold Niebuhr suggests that when we try to figure out how to create a good life, security for ourselves, and fail, that can lead to despair. So we think often despair comes from optimism, or from pessimism, And we might expect it does come from some forms of pessimism. But it, strangely enough, also comes from some forms of optimism. Hope, at least a Christian robust hope, is a thoroughly theological idea. It is something that comes from God and that humans live into by surrendering to God. And this sort of hope is not something we can control. It's not something at our disposal to do with what we want. It is a gift from God. We live into it, but we cannot control it. Optimism, on the other hand, is very often a very human attempt to try and figure out, through some sort of calculus, how things will turn out well for us. I won't get sick because it's not in my genes. I won't get whatever. We do it all the time. Optimism is based on some sort of often unconscious calculus about why things are going to go well for us. The world, unfortunately, is filled with unpredictable changes and chances, and these changes and chances often thwart our calculus, so that our attempt to secure a good life fails. And when we fail to secure the good life that we want, and when we begin to realize that actually this might be beyond our ability, it might be something that we are just simply unable to do to get the good life that we want. This, according to Niebuhr, is what leads to despair. We can imagine a good future, but when we look at the world as it is, it all seems so unrealistic and so naive. Despair. The only remedy is, again, through imagination. I would suggest a spirit-inspired imagination. Entertain the idea for a moment. You don't need to be convinced it's going to happen. Just entertain, let it enter in your consciousness, God's promised alternative future. Just let it sit there in your imagination and let it dance in your thoughts. So Jeremiah is a prophet who lived probably about 600-700 years before Christ, and he interpreted the times for the people. According to his interpretation, the people had not been faithful to Yahweh, to the God of Israel, and because of this, God was going to let the king of Babylon conquer Judea. Now, with our view of military and history and so forth, we might interpret things a little differently, but that's how Jeremiah saw it. This is what ended up happening. Babylon did take over, and it was horrible. It was a nightmare. It was a terrible experience. The people were slaves, and many were exiled away from their homeland. They looked at the present as they lived in Babylon, far, far away from the temple, and what they saw was bleak and terrible. Based on their present, they saw no hope for the future. And this led to despair. And then into this despair, Jeremiah tells the people, the days are surely coming. He tells them, for a moment, just turn your gaze away from the terrible things that is today. And just imagine for a moment, just let this strange alternative future enter your imagination. Jeremiah is speaking this hope to the exiles. Now, hope is a strange thing. I'm going to say more about hope later, but hope is built into hope is darkness. It's a strange thing. It's a little bit of a paradox. Hope emerges in the context of bad times. You don't hope when everything's as perfect as it could be. You always hope because you are in bad times. So the fact that you're in bad times, or that you might feel that the world is in bad times, is not a reason to not hope. It's actually a reason to hope. That's where hope grows. The day is surely coming, Jeremiah continues, when God will cause a righteous branch to spring up for David. And this righteous branch will execute justice and righteousness in the land. And in those days, Judah will be saved and Jerusalem will live in safety. While this is often understood to be thinking about Christ, in its original context, Jeremiah is talking about the restoration of the Davidic monarchy. So David, as we all know, was the first king in this lineage of kings. And according to promises that had been given to David, this monarchy was going to last forever. It was never going to have an end. But then it did end when the people were conquered by Babylon. So the expectations and the realities collided, and despair. So Jeremiah wants to breathe hope into the people. He wants to challenge them to imagine an impossible future. Not because it's realistic, but because the Spirit makes it possible. He wants to challenge them to imagine a future where they will return to their own land, where they will regain their cultural and national autonomy. They did get to see this new day. They did go back to the land, but the Davidic dynasty never really got off the ground again. And we might think, oh, well, that must be a failed prophecy. Didn't happen the way he said it was going to happen. But again, I started, and this is important to remember, prophecy is not about divining what's going to happen in the future. That's a false understanding of prophecy. It's about the experience of hope. It's not about telling you what's going to happen in the ever-mysterious future. It's about, I'm going to say it again, the experience of hope, which is so important. We need hope. It is more about the act of hope, the birth of hope in our souls, than the reality of the object of hope. God is faithful, and somehow I believe this hope is justified, based on truth. But again, it's not about divining the future. We as a species are locked in time. I don't know what's going to happen after death, but at least before death, we are locked in time, and that's not going to change. The future will remain mysterious till the day we die. Just the way it is. Might not be something you want to hear, but that's just the way it is. We're never going to know what's going to happen in the future, ever, with any sort of certainty. We know we're going to die, certain sort of general things, but beyond those general things, it remains ever mysterious. So the future remains ever out of reach. We all only have direct access to the present. And while hope seems to be and is focused on the future, it is actually something that's very anchored in the present. It is in the present that we hope. It is in the present that we let this wild imagination have some space in our mind. It is in the present that we refuse to take the world as it sometimes presents itself to us, as this is it, but this can't be changed. This is the only way it can be. Hope says no. It insists on seeing God in everything, everywhere, and in doing this, it transforms everything and refuses to take everything at face value. This opens up room for an alternative future that God imagines. God has an imagination. We say that in the doxology, that God can do much more than we can ask or imagine. God has an imagination, and it's bigger than our imagination. So a couple more things about hope. Hope, unlike optimism sometimes, does not pretend that everything is fine. It does not pretend that everything is okay. Everything, certainly in the world as we see it right now, is not fine. Everything is not okay. Hope leads us to really embrace the world as it really is. And in a time of climate crisis, of war and genocide, chaos, division, it's easy to want to just sort of hide from those truths, pretend that they're not really as bad as they really are, but they are really that bad. But in the time of all those troubles, we also cannot afford to fall into despair. The world does not permit us that luxury, so to speak. Too much is required of us. So we read Jeremiah on the first day of Advent. Advent has been subtly distorted, shall I say, in our culture. It becomes kind of like just a prelude to Christmas, sort of just like the Hobbit is to the Lord of the Rings. It's really about Christmas. And Christmas is often about nostalgia. It's about those golden moments of our childhood that we try to relive, the fireplace with the hot mug of hot chocolate, gathered with family around the Christmas tree. And so it would be a real sad day if Advent really caused us to look back like that with that kind of nostalgic gaze, when really what Advent is all about is daring to imagine a new day that has never been. A new day that has never been. That's really what Advent is calling us to. It's not calling us to be nostalgic, to try to relive some old day that probably never existed, that we've created in our imagination, or to try and hide away from the inevitable future through consumerism or the many other ways we hide away from the inevitable future. Advent rather dares us to boldly imagine an alternative future, an impossible future where justice and righteousness are in the land. Dares us to hope for this through the Spirit. It's not something we just try to generate on our own steam, something we do as we yield and give ourselves over to the Spirit. And at the end of the day, the future will remain the future. It always will. and its mysteries will remain unknown. But if we have hope today, that is enough. And that's what really Advent is about. Today we celebrate the first, and there's a kind of you could build around any of these things, but in many ways, hope is a building block for the others. Without hope, it's hard to look for peace in a world where it seems that peace is impossible. Well, hope says anything you call impossible, look at that. Look at that. Is it really? So let us dare imagine this future, this strange, surprising future that is God, that resides in God's imagination. May the Spirit lift our eyes to consider this impossible, wonderful future, just for a moment, because the days are surely coming, says the Lord,